It rained on Monday morning, September 15th, over all Louisiana. From low darkening clouds, the drops spattered on the state's good highways, on its hundreds of marshy mud roads, pine forests, and deep swamps full of quicksand. The rain fell too on 350,000 U.S. soldiers and 50,000 U.S. Army vehicles as they fought the greatest sham battle in U.S. history. The attack had come before dawn, with two fast-moving, hard-hitting armored divisions leading the way. Lieutenant General Ben Lear, commander of the 2nd Red Army, had pushed his troops across the muddy Red River and was already sending long tentacles down the highways to the south, where Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's 3rd Blue Army lay in wait.
This is an excerpt from the October 6, 1941 issue of Life magazine, which carried a multi-page feature article highlighting the largest mass training maneuvers undertaken by the U.S. Army. The mock battles of what became known as the Louisiana Maneuvers had one purpose: to prepare America's soldiers for the war that had already begun in Europe and was threatening to spread around the world. The Louisiana Maneuvers were a prelude to World War II. Likewise, the rudimentary barracks and facilities that sprang up as a result of the massive exercises were a prelude to the importance of Central Louisiana to the U.S. Armed Forces. And so Camp Polk was born. As World War II intensified, so did visits to Camp Polk by Army leaders who would become American legends: Eisenhower, Clark, Bradley, and Patton. In 1941, the great General George C. Marshall spoke some words that would become Fort Polk's greatest mission. He said, "I want the mistakes made down in Louisiana, not over in Europe. And the only way to do this is try it out. And if it doesn't work, find out what we need to make it work." 73 years later, that idea is still at the forefront of the installation's mission: to train soldiers and save lives. Today, historians agree that the Louisiana maneuvers were so effective in preparing our military for combat that they helped predispose a favorable outcome for the free world at the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, the American public, grown weary of tragic carnage, began focusing on peace and prosperity and the speedy return of the servicemen and women from overseas. The victorious U.S. Army, the most powerful on earth, rapidly began disarming. Some 12 million Americans wore military uniforms at the height of World War II. Within a few years, the Army cut back in size to pre-World War II levels. By 1946, Camp Polk was designated a medical training center and only a skeleton force remained. Finally, in December, military officials declared Fort Polk inactive and the now empty barracks stood quiet.
When the nation called again, Camp Polk answered. In the early morning hours of June 25, 1950, more than 100,000 North Korean soldiers surged across the 38th parallel to invade South Korea. In August of 1950, the 45th Infantry Division, Oklahoma National Guard, reported for duty at Camp Polk. Camp Polk shook off the dust accumulated from disuse and once again teamed with soldiers training for war. 70% of the troops who first reported to Camp Polk that year had served in World War II, but thousands of other draftees or volunteers soon arrived. With no previous combat experience, these new soldiers quickly learned enough at Camp Polk to wage war and survive. And learn they did. Once again, the words spoken by General George C. Marshall in 1941 became Camp Polk's most vital mission. Only the combat theater had changed. Those inexperienced soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division, along with their combat-hardened comrades in arms, became the heroes of battles like Heartbreak Ridge, Pork Chop Hill, and Luke's Castle. But after the Korean War ended in 1954, Camp Polk's future was once again uncertain, and that year the installation closed.
A scant year later, tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union grew to alarming proportions, an era called the Red Scare. With the world seemingly once again on the brink of World War, this time a nuclear war, the Army began searching anew for a place to conduct maneuvers. Once again, as they had done before World War II, civic and local government leaders fanned out in Vernon Parish, asking landowners to sign documents allowing the Army to use their land. In 1955, Camp Polk, now called Fort Polk, reopened in preparation for Operation Sagebrush. America's biggest peacetime exercise since the 1941 Louisiana maneuvers, some 85,000 troops participated, significantly fewer than the 400,000 involved 14 years earlier. The Sagebrush exercises, which lasted 15 days, covered a substantial portion of Louisiana, stretching east-west from Alexandria to the Sabine River and north-south from near Shreveport to between DeRidder and Lake Charles. Possibly the most famous soldier involved in the Sagebrush exercises? Audie Murphy, whom Life magazine had dubbed the most decorated soldier of World War II. While in Louisiana, Murphy's autobiography, To Hell and Back, was a bestseller, helping cement his popularity with soldiers and local residents. Murphy conducted combat training for the 36th Infantry Division, a National Guard unit, during his time at Fort Polk. He also fought in simulated battles on Peason Ridge, where so many earlier practice skirmishes had occurred in 1941. When the Sagebrush exercises ended, the 1st Armored Division began establishing new headquarters at Fort Polk, and the installation again reverberated with the sounds of cannons, machine guns, and soldiers marching in cadence. Lines of M18 Patton tanks, much heavier than their World War II counterparts, raced across training areas. The military's highest echelons chose Fort Polk and the 1st Armored Division to test mobility and combat strategies for the nuclear age. But in June of 1959, Fort Polk shut down completely. Many local businesses closed and citizens left seeking better opportunities. With the growing Berlin crisis in 1961, the 49th Armored Division began rolling into Fort Polk, and in June of 1962, the installation became an infantry training center. Its new mission? To provide basic training for individual soldiers, many of them draftees. Fort Polk offered them their introduction to the military, and most would never forget the experience. The number of soldiers who trained at Fort Polk grew in correlation with the increased Army presence in Southeast Asia, where the U.S. was propping up the non-communist government of South Vietnam. Training American soldiers how to fight in difficult jungle conditions became a top priority. Again, Fort Polk's environment fit the bill. Our total focus, said one former drill instructor, was on training these young men to survive. An echo of the words spoken by General George C. Marshall 20 years before. And so Tigerland was born. More than 1 million soldiers trained at Fort Polk during the Vietnam War. They trained in 2 simulated Vietnamese hamlets at Tigerland, which featured earthen berms, sharpened bamboo stake defenses, and booby trap simulations. A sign at the entrance to the mock thatched village welcomed trainees to Tigerland, home of the Vietnam combat soldiers. Based on accounts of what soldiers saw in Vietnam, Fort Polk engineers designed a tunnel system beneath Tigerland. Soldiers were taught how to squeeze through the narrow passageways, to repress their claustrophobia, and to gain an advantage over foes who lived like moles. The realism of Tigerland was a foreshadowing to the mock Iraqi and Afghanistan village that would pepper our training area more than 40 years later. By 1969, Fort Polk had dispatched more soldiers to Vietnam than any other military post in the nation. But as the war escalated, so did the controversy over American involvement. Public sentiment at times soured to the point that some returning soldiers faced derisive protest. Many in the military felt reviled or ignored after having risked their lives for their country. Some 58,000 Americans died serving in Southeast Asia, and the psychological wounds have been slow to heal. Objective military analysts agreed, though, that the American troops who fought in Vietnam displayed extraordinary skill, dedication, and bravery, standards that Fort Polk was instrumental in fostering among thousands of soldiers. And in the future, Fort Polk would take to heart how every American soldier should be welcomed home from conflict. Fort Polk underwent major changes as the Vietnam War ended. Then President Richard Nixon orchestrated elimination of the military draft, transforming the Army into an all-volunteer force. By 1974, boot camp for individual soldiers at Fort Polk tapered off when the post took on a new role housing the storied 5th Infantry Mechanized Division. At the same time, a major building program transformed Fort Polk from a site with structures mostly dating to the World War II era to one of the most modern Army posts in the country. Between 1975 and 1990, the Army invested about $700 million in new post facilities. With an all-volunteer Army, soldiers began settling in the area with their families, and relationships between Fort Polk and the local communities, always cordial, flourished. In 1991, the drums of war beat once more for the nation. Fort Polk was ready. The installation dispatched 9 support groups totaling some 8,000 soldiers to the Middle East during the Gulf War. These specialists, many of them associated with the National Guard or Army Reserve, were important to the rapid victory over Saddam Hussein and his Republican Guard, although many never fired a shot. One of the most ferocious battles of the Gulf War, the Battle of 73 Easting, was led by the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, the oldest continually serving regiment in the Army. The 2nd ACR, soon to be stationed at Fort Polk, traveled more than 150 miles through Iraq and cracked through Republican Guard defenses, capturing more than 2,000 prisoners and destroying at least 159 Iraqi tanks. The 2nd ACR was one of only 2 units given the Valorous Unit Award for actions during the war. A year later, Fort Polk once again saw the end of an era when in 1992 the Army ordered the 5th Infantry to deactivate and retire its colors. In 1993, the Joint Readiness Training Center moved from Fort Chaffee, Arkansas to Fort Polk, thus beginning the installation's reputation as the Army's premier combat training center. During the 1990s, American soldiers trained at JRTC, and Fort Polk-based soldiers deployed to Haiti, Southwest Asia, Suriname, Panama, Bosnia, and more. As Fort Polk grew, so did the surrounding communities, as well as the support received by those communities. Then came September 11, 2001, a defining moment in American history. In October of that year, the United States invaded Afghanistan in response to the terrorist attacks. 1.5 years later, on March 20, 2003, the Iraq War began. Patriotism proliferated throughout the country, and nowhere was that more evident than on Fort Polk as our soldiers prepared for war. JRTC rotations, always important, became a critical training tool for soldiers. The overarching theme of the JRTC, we want our soldiers' worst day to be here rather than in a combat theater. A reminder that Fort Polk's mission endures now and has since 1941.
Since 9/11, more than 2.7 million American soldiers have deployed overseas, many of them 2, 3, and 4 times. 50% of those soldiers trained here at the Joint Readiness Training Center and Fort Polk. Families have served and sacrificed too. The Army responded by addressing their quality of life needs. Since 2005, the Army has invested billions of dollars in Fort Polk modernization on new facilities, entertainment activities, housing and barracks, roads, water quality, education, and other initiatives. Fort Polk is now one of 3 posts singled out for quality of life improvements. The community, too, embraces our soldiers and families, creating for them a home away from home. The community gives its time, resources, funding, commitment to social events, job opportunities, and genuine care promise for families. Military appreciation is at an all-time high, as is soldier and family involvement in the community. The common goal between Fort Polk and communities throughout the state is to grow Fort Polk and make life better for everyone. As Fort Polk modernizes to meet the nation's needs, so does the Joint Readiness Training Center. As operations in Afghanistan draw down, the rotational model switched from the mission rehearsal exercises that prepared our soldiers for the mission in Iraq and Afghanistan to the operational concept known as decisive action. A focus on soldiers' core competencies after a long 19-year war, but as it's been since 1941, the mission remains the same: training our soldiers, Security Force Assistance Brigades, National Guard and Reserve units, and joint forces from allied nations for whatever tasks lie ahead. The Joint Readiness Training Center carries a tangible legacy of the men and women in uniform who have served Fort Polk and our country throughout the years. It's not found in the buildings and infrastructure of the installation. It is carried in the hearts and minds of our veterans, soldiers, families, and communities we call home. As the Joint Readiness Training Center and Fort Polk celebrate our 80th anniversary, we continue to train brigade combat teams and international partners to fight and win conflicts that arise, curate and improve international relationships, and ensure the best quality of life of any installation in the Army.